Hi, Utkarsha. Thank you so much for joining Mentality. It's one of the first videos we are doing for Pride Month. And I am really glad that you could make it, take some time out and talk to us about
Mm,
what it actually feels like to be a queer person
mm,
in a therapy room or in a
mm,
counseling session. But also talk a little bit about your expertise, which is queer affirmative
mm.
thing. And so, if I can just take a couple of minutes to tell our audiences about you. Utkarsha is a trauma informed and a queer affirmative practitioner, and she is also the founder of the Coping Central. She's here to talk to us about what it actually feels like to be on both sides of this table, and where we can talk and maybe dive deeper into queer affirmative counseling. And so, Utkarsha, maybe we should start with literally the most basic question: what who is a queer affirmative practitioner and what does that actually mean?
Hmm. So I think being a queer affirmative practitioner really means that you understand that queerness, it's not just about somebody's identity or just a label. It's about their whole personhood and how they interact with the world and how it sort of also gets impacted by the world that we're living in. And it exists in a context, not in a vacuum. And I think a lot of times people often ask about this, that if I'm queer friendly, how is it different from being queer affirmative? And I think affirmation is where you kind of take one step ahead and you truly sort of embody those values, not just in terms of reassuring the client that it's okay being queer, but actually sort of, display it in your practice. And the politics that you hold, the conversations you hold in the therapy session, how you contextualize a case, all of it is impacted by your training in being a queer affirmative therapist.
Right, right. Yeah. And so, how has your experience been? So, for how long have you done this? And
Mm,
what is that given you really?
mm. I've been a therapist now for a little over 6 years. And I feel like that, and since the beginning, of course, like I said, that because of my training, like since the beginning, I have worked extensively with people, coming uh, with identities of queerness and trans people. And, like it's something that I have sort of, that has also made me unlearn, relearn a lot of principles that my textbooks taught me. And I think that the idea of therapy that we're taught in training spaces is very heterosexual, very white, very cisgendered, but then when you practice in a country like ours, where there is so much variance, where there is so much diversity, there are so many intersections that our queerness can also exist on.
Yeah.
You learn to kind of understand that your practice can't be the same with every client. And, it's something that will have to live and evolve with each story that comes in. So I think it's been an experience of, like I said, unlearning and relearning over and over again.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we did a story at Mentality on, how, I mean, there was a larger story, but there was a part of the story where we spoke about how, the pedagogy in India really only talks about cis and heterosexual, especially when you're, so there's the idea of queerness is not necessarily
Mm,
introduced in educational institutions when they're teaching people how to be counselors and therapists and psychologists. And I'm not really sure about the medical aspect of it. Like, I don't know how
mm,
psychiatrists deal with it, but specifically in the social
mm,
psychology space,
mm,
it's an alien concept, and you would think that that would have changed by now, right? Like, you would
mm,
that we've there have been battles that people have fought for all these decades, that we are now reached a space where we don't have to fight for
mm,
education system to really talk about something as basic as that. uh,
mm,
but did that kind of, there must have been something that
mm,
changed
mm.
the way
No, and yeah, no, I'm sure like there's been shifts, and like I said, that the shift has kind of come up in a way where you're taught that, oh, you might encounter people from different sexualities and genders in your practice, But then how do you practice differently is something that's not really taught again in traditional formal education, right? Like nobody really teaches you that when you're talking to a queer person, when you're talking to a trans person, the dynamics of their relationship will not follow the same script that a heterosexual relationship does, right? So the questions that we also walk in with as a therapist, or the biases that we might walk in with, they fall flat. Do we then evolve, or do we continue sort of waiting for them to kind of fit that mold in some way?
Yeah.
And I often give this example, right? Like if a client is coming in and they're telling me that they are experiencing a lot of anxiety, do I check for the fact, as to how many people around them feel safe for them, how many people around them know about their sexuality, how many people around them know about their gender? So is the anxiety like a general anxiety disorder diagnosis, or is it just a very natural response to living a life that's hidden from everyone around you, right? So I think these are the distinctions, these are the nuances that we're yet to come to. So we've started acknowledging that there will be people from different identities who will sort of sit with, but nobody tells us that our practice also looks vastly different with that.
Yeah, yeah. I know that if you're a doctor, you get to do some internship, you get to actually be, in a hospital setting or in a medical kind of setting. Um, how do counselors actually deal with, like, are
Mm,
you dropped in the far end of the pool right at the get,
mm,
or do you
mm,
kind of get to learn the tricks of the trade? Do you do an
mm,
apprenticeship? um, if that doesn't happen, like I'm guessing it doesn't, uh,
mm,
is it actually worth doing something like that, especially for people with who have a lot more needs? uh,
mm,
when I say a lot more, it's obviously comparative, but people who are dealing with hidden identities, like you said,
mm,
which is a
mm,
really difficult problem
mm,
to be struggling
mm,
with.
mm. I think the unfortunate sort of um, condition of the state right now is the fact that there is no uniformity in how the training and the apprenticeship and how internships happen, right? Like, while of course colleges and educational institutions ask the students to kind of go do an internship, but again, it's so sort of motivated by just the idea of ticking it off like a checklist, that nobody's really caring for the quality and what is it that they're learning. So nobody's asking people or asking young people to get that specific training so that you'll be more ready for practice in the field, but everyone's just asking to go get any training, because that's what our responsibility is sort of done, and that's where it ends. There are a couple of really sort of good training programs also, that is like that's run by legacy institutions, that those are run by organizations, including TIS for what it's worth. But again, it's accessible to such a small
Yeah,
sort of pool of people, that there like so many people that I know, so many young people are studying to be a psychologist, but then have no idea as to how to access these spaces and how to access these trainings. So it's also almost like gate kept enough to keep a lot of people out, but also not as much to be like, over gatekeeping this. I think
yeah.
that's the unfortunate sort of space that we're in right now.
Yeah, I completely. So the reason I asked you this question is because a lot of people we spoke to during the course of our reporting and a couple of other stories in the pipeline, a lot of them said that finding the right therapist, counselor, is trial and error.
Mm,
So you go to somebody, you spend a couple of sessions with them, works, doesn't work. It also depends on your mental state at that point of.
mm,
Are you ready? Are you not
mm,
ready? Does the person have the ability to pull you out of
mm,
on readiness? And this kind of hurdle, the bar becomes higher, especially for the queer community. And
mm.
so therefore this question, right? So how many trial and errors can you do, especially when cost of therapy is actually pretty high,
Yeah,
and it's not easy for people to be able to afford therapy.
yeah.
So this trial and error method is, it seems like there is no way around it. Have
Mm,
you had people when we're talking about the queer community, have you had people who've come and say, look, I tried, whatever X number of therapy sessions with somebody else and it didn't work, and so this is the burden? I was like, how often do you hear something like this? We've heard
Yeah.
a lot of it.
Yeah, no, we've also really heard it a lot. Like this is something that we also ask in the first sort of intake call, no? That have you been in therapy? What has worked? What hasn't worked? And the mechanism that we try to follow is do more of what's worked for the person and do less of what's not worked. But I think like it's also such an emotional labor that a person's putting in as a client, because they're going in, they're opening up about so many things in their life, and then say like some of it is also, I think, the nature of how therapy is, right? Like some of it is that it's so relational in the way that it functions that you can't find a way around but trial and error. But I think some component of it can be improved and can be controlled if we're focusing on trainings like, queer affirmative practice,
Yeah,
where if a queer person is coming in, at least they can be assured and secure about the fact that there might be a good chance that me and my therapist might not vibe,
yeah,
and that's a different thing. But at least I'm okay with the fact that they've trained in this and they won't sort of dismiss my life experiences.
yeah,
And I think the training part of it is something that can be controlled, that can be sort of used to sort of bring in a reform of sorts in this space. Because even if it's 50% that's only relationship based, then it might still be trial and error. But even if you're able to control the rest 50, that will sort of bring out, like a lot of different ways in which therapy functions for people.
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, you're so right. I mean, this is again something that has come up in our conversations. But one thing I wanted to ask you was, you know, when we published our first piece, we spoke to people who said when they walked into a therapy session, one of the questions they got asked right at the start is, how do you know you're gay? Or how do you know
Mm,
you're queer, right? And we have a particular practice at Mentality where we run our pieces past certain sensitive
mm,
readers. So readers like you, people who understand the space, will give
mm,
it before we publish.
mm,
We'll say, well, are we using the right words?
mm,
Are we referring to communities in
mm,
more sensitive way, etc., etc. So when we sent it to our sensitivity readers, some of them responded saying, come on, this is such a like a basic question. This is such a, this is not a question you get asked today. This is what used to happen 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
mm,
And that kind of brought about this gap that we were seeing.
mm,
So if you went to, so some of the people we spoke to were from the hinterlands of Punjab, from parts of Bengal, non-metro cities. And for them, how do you know you're queer is the top question.
yeah,
But
yeah,
sitting, let's say, in South Bombay and South Delhi and South Bangalore, it's not really a question. It's just it's something which happens. So this gap,
mm,
when you see something like this in your practice, how do you kind of then bridge this gap in the sense
mm,
that how do you, from wherever you are, go transport yourself to the position of the person who's sitting across from you?
mm, mm. I think something that I always sort of say is this, that, interestingly, while of course social media and Instagram has made us more aware, and so much of our knowledge now also comes from that space, but um it's also very nicely created a bubble where we'll only follow the people who speak our language and they'll follow us back. And then we're very nicely, comfortably in this illusion that, oh, everyone knows this. And, this is the norm. Why is it being questioned? But then when we really go out and talk to people and understand their stories and experiences, we understand that it's just 1% or 2% of people who are speaking the same language and understand the same concepts, and there is so much work that needs to be done at a community level. And I think, to sort of also come back to what you asked, right, that I think more than to be able to transport myself in the person's life, one thing that kind of stays as a baseline for me as an organization also at the Coping Central is this, that we always say that we know therapy, but you know your life.
Yeah,
And we can sort of have that accumulation or that sort of sync when we are able to sort of not be an expert of your life. And
yeah,
I think that's really important. Like this question also, when we look at it, that how do you know you're queer or you're gay? almost puts me in an authority position of you need to sort of tell me so that I can judge if it's a correct how or it's a correct answer to the how or not, right? So again, I'm kind of giving myself that power of being the authority who can evaluate your life. And
Yes.
I think that's the one thing that we need to establish in therapy rooms, especially, is that it's not to say that there is invisible power that exists, right? And not addressing it does more harm than addressing, I mean, like, than kind of saying that there is power. But we don't have to misuse that power. We don't have to sort of keep stepping into that power. We acknowledge that power, it exists with us. But what is it that we can do to sort of make therapy feel like an equitable process where I get to participate in your life, as a spectator, as a meaning maker, instead of as an evaluator? I think that's the idea that we also go with.
Yeah, no, I really like what you said about you might know therapy, but they really know their lives. And that's such a profound way of looking at it, where, the equitable distribution of, because regardless of how you look at it in the therapy room, the therapist does have more power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the other person comes with a lot of vulnerability.
Yeah.
So there is that humility that probably needs to be, I guess, more on the side of the therapist. One of the questions that have been thrown at us over and over again, in a lot of these spaces where we've tried to do reporting, from the queer community, is, should every queer person do therapy? This is again
Mm.
a question that comes up again and again. So should
Mm.
every queer person do therapy just because, for instance, hidden identities, for
Mm.
instance, the question of identity is something that they have to come to terms with
Mm.
themselves, in
Mm.
order to quote unquote fit in. So all of
Mm.
these fundamental reasons why
Mm.
every queer person should do therapy. So this is,
Mm.
I mean, it's a question to you. So do you think, every queer person
Mm.
should do therapy? how
Mm.
how does one deal with a question like that?
Mm.
I was a bit caught off guard when somebody asked me this, when I was in this village in Rajasthan, and we were talking to a bunch of boys. And it's a village in northern Rajasthan. A bunch of boys who were, like you said,
Mm.
Instagram exposed, understand queerness, flaunting their identities. But this question came up, and they said,
Mm.
we want to do therapy, we can't afford it, but we think every queer person should do therapy.
Mm. Mm. I think this whole idea of it being like a should immediately also kind of brings a lot of discomfort to me, because I'm like, oh, but I can say that every queer person could benefit from therapy because of the systems that we have grown up in. But I think should sort of brings in this idea of compulsion that there's something wrong with you if you're not doing therapy. And I don't think that's an idea that we'd want to propagate. I feel like that. Saying that okay, every queer person should do therapy unfortunately makes it a personal problem instead of a broken system problem. And
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that, um could every person who's lived life on the margins and with hidden identities help with the witnessing of therapy? Could they benefit from the witnessing that therapy provides? Yes. But does it mean that they have to go to therapy to kind of change parts of their life or their selves or behavior? No. If you find spaces, if you find communities, if you find safety, if you find again the feeling of being seen and held in spaces outside of therapy, I think that's where also a lot of healing and a lot of wellness exists.
Yeah.
So again, like I think this whole idea of one-on-one isolated healing, very right. It doesn't sort of kind of give us the amount of need for community that we have had growing up in a country like ours.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's really got nothing to do with the queer community per se, but then we did this story on Chopals and the vanishing of the system of a chop.
Mm,
The village
mm,
community center where people would just meet and not do anything, like
yeah,
gossip, chit chat, random chat, just nothing specific, and
yeah.
just how that and what that did to the mental well-being of communities. But to just go back to one of the points you made, which is a central focus, really, of our work here, is accountability.
Hmm.
And the fact that, when you say things like, yes, every person or every queer person should do therapy, then it becomes a very individual problem.
Hmm.
And an individual problem, then there's no accountability. The system has no accountability. So unless we look at systemic issues,
Yeah.
then we can't really seek accountability. But in your experience, I mean, we just saw the transgender bill, and we understand how policy works. But in your experience, if there are, systems that can change,
Hmm.
what would be top of mind thing? Like, if you're not allowed to think, and if you're allowed to kind of just,
Hmm.
what is it that those systemic changes that
Hmm.
the ideal world uh,
Hmm.
would happen? Where what
Hmm.
point at?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is just safety, physical, emotional, safety that will come in. And even like you said, like even when we're looking at the transgender bill and the way that it sort of came in, and I remember that there were so many distress calls and messages, and like during that time, and of course all of those groups are still alive, and it's the momentum is a little slower, but people do still come into therapy and talk about the fact that it's still so uncertain. We don't know what is it, and you can't erase a whole identity. You can't sort of also put it under so much policing and just like moral judgment in that way. And I think so safety in general is something that will instantly increase, right? Like, because if you're not threatened constantly that you will be kicked out of the family, or you'll be kicked out of a relationship, you'll be kicked out of a nation, you'll be kicked out of a job. The moment you're not scared of these things, you will just automatically have more bandwidth to focus on joy and pleasure and your own sort of contentment. And if we're worried about something as basic as safety, so much of our energy also goes into keeping ourselves safe, no, in the face of constant threat and danger.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have toddlers at home, and one of the things that we keep talking about is just keeping them safe. So this idea of, love and affection and all of these things become
Yeah,
really, like, far reaching, when
yeah.
the most basic thing that they need is safety. And when you blow that idea up to communities, to nations, to individuals who form these communities, well, then I guess security kind of tops that list. I know, and I'm saying this for the benefit of the audience, that Utkarsha and I, when we spoke for the first time, I did ask her if it is okay for me to ask this question about what it feels like to be a queer person in a therapy room. And therefore, I'm asking this question, Utkarsha. Maybe we could end with this, but tell us a bit about what, if I am a queer person, and there's might be a lot of generalization to this, but what does it feel like for me to be sitting in a therapy room and
Hmm.
for me to be vulnerable?
Hmm. I think it's a lot of like I could say the nice thing first, which can mean that, oh, that to be witnessed finally and to be seen in my trueness and my personhood. But before we get to the good thing, I think it's a big risk,
Yeah,
because at any point of time you're, again, and this is something I often also talk to my clients about, and I acknowledge it very actively, that I know you've taken a risk to sit in front of a stranger and tell your life story, and to trust my word that I'll keep your information confidential and private, right? Like, so it's the honor of that contract that a person is doing while sitting in front of me. And I am, of course, also honoring that contract. But again, because of the power that I hold, maybe as a therapist, and like, say, if there's a therapist whose gender identity is different from the client, whose sexuality is different from the client, if it's a straight cisgendered person and they're working with a queer person, or they're working with a trans person, so they don't just hold power as a therapist, but they also hold power in their sexual and gender identity. And so I think, like, for a queer person to also come to therapy and kind of just navigate the water, like, there is a lot of joy and a lot of witnessing that eventually hopefully follows once that rapport and relationship is formed. But I think the initial few times it can also feel like taking a big risk. And
yeah,
I think even for the therapist, I often ask this to kind of think about that. think what would it mean for that person to be able to take this risk and still trust you.
Yes.
Try to question that what is it that they're valuing more than their hypothetical safety in that moment, and are you able to sort of provide that sort of value, care, compassion to that, to them in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Utkarsha, any last thoughts? Anything that you want to talk about?
Mm,
Anything that you want to tell, maybe the community or in general our audiences? Most of our audiences are sensitive to the issues that we're talking about. But if you have last
mm,
words of,
mm,
how we should look at ourselves,
mm,
and the way we think and the way
mm,
that's kind of top for us at mentality,
mm.
where we are looking inwards more than outwards, where we are
Yeah.
trying to kind of understand why we are feeling the way we are feeling towards maybe a person, a thing, a subject, a community, an event,
Mm,
news.
mm, mm. I think something that is important for us to sort of also keep in mind, that people's identities, their sexuality, our gender, it's not it's not limited to just one area of our life, which is romantic relationships or attraction or who we're sleeping with or who we're with. In some ways, it's a whole person thing that they're bringing in, right? Like it impacts who we interact with, who are our friends, how do we invest money, which bank we use, which restaurant we go to, where do we have fun, which school we go to. So, it really sort of impacts all areas of our life. So, as people who are interacting with people from the community, whether it's a therapist or just in any ways, try to sort of not reduce identities to just one section of the life, and try to sort of look at it as like a whole person and their personhood standing in front of you.
Right, right. Thank you so much for this, Utkarsha. Hopefully, we get to speak more, and maybe tailor our conversations, to a lot more focused topics in the future. But thanks a lot for joining us and taking the
Thank you,
time.
Raksha. Yes,
Thank
of
you.
course.
Bye bye.